Okay, Anthony, so you should have already completed it's about a 6-minute video, I think it is, where you answer the questions, some basic overview questions on James Monroe and his presidency. And so if you haven't done that, now go ahead, stop this video, go back, make sure you get that video and those questions completed. Again, at any of the videos that you see, you can always pause when you've found the answer to make sure you have plenty of time to get it written down. Okay, so if you have to re-watch that video to make sure you have all the questions answered, make sure you do that. Now for this, what we're going to do is we're going to cover Monroe's presidency, and the way that we do that is with what's called the 4 dilemmas or scenarios of Monroe's presidency. Okay, so there's 4 big things that he has to deal with, and they sort of define the second part of his presidency. Now, as you see here on the screen, it says the Monroe presidency, aka the era of good feelings. So the first part of his presidency is definitely defined like this: is the era of good feelings. Time when people are getting along. We just come out of the War of 1812, and Americans saw this as a victory, and there's all kinds of really good things going on. People are getting along, and so that's why it's called the era of good feelings. Unfortunately for Monroe, this does not last throughout his entire presidency, and there are some pretty big things that he has to deal with and work through. Okay, so, all right, now, the way we'll do this is I'm going to present you with one scenario or dilemma at a time. Now, I'm going to give you some basic information, and what you'll see on the screen is where you'll be able to fill in those blanks for your notes. Okay, now I'm going to give you some extra information along the way, just to help you kind of understand some context and what's completely what is going on here. Now, once I've given you the basic information, what I'm going to want you to do is to pause and fill in that next column on the chart where it says basically, what would you do? So what I want you to think is, just for a few moments, if you are in Monroe's position, what would you do with the scenario that we're talking about? Okay, this is definitely when you'll pause the video, take some time, and actually do write that down. Okay, not a lot of detail on that, but just something very straightforward. Okay, so here we go. First issue was a border dispute with Canada. Okay, so what you'll see here on this map is the orange section is that's all United States, and then of course you have Louisiana, and up through this green section here, and this is basically the land for the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, but then what we have in this little area right up here, okay, right here, is a border dispute with Canada, which is, you'll recall, is controlled by the British. Now, the issue is that the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution said that the western boundary of the United States was to go along the Mississippi River up to, there's this lake that's up in this area somewhere, and that would define the border. Problem, Mississippi River doesn't actually go to there. It actually ducks off into this area here. So what that leads to is both countries thinking they have control over certain periods of land. So this section down here, right in here, all right, it actually, the British are under the belief, well, they control that because of where the Mississippi River runs. The Americans, on the other hand, say, no, not only do we control this, but we actually control up into here, according to the treaty, because again, where this river, where this lake is, and all this stuff. Okay, and so there's a dispute. Okay, now disputes can be worked out a number of different ways, and so now you have some basic information. Okay, remembering that we just came out of the War of 1812 with the British, and that went, well, different opinions on that, but in the end, what we have here is, I just want your opinion. What would you do if you are in President Monroe's position? Okay, so write it down. Again, I'm not looking for a lot of detail on that, just an opinion. What would you do? How would you try to resolve this? Okay, so go ahead and pause the video now, go ahead and write your answer in, and then start it up again. and I'll give you the information of what actually happened. Okay, so you should have gone ahead and written in what you would do. So now let's take a look at what actually happened. So there's two main components of what actually happened. Piece number one is what's called the Rush-Bagot Agreement. Now what this did was limit the naval power of both countries on the Great Lakes. Now if you think back to geography, the Great Lakes, 4 of the 5 Great Lakes actually help to form the border between the United States and Canada. Okay, and they connect, and it's actually quite a bit. They're huge, of course, that's why they get their name, Great Lakes. And so there's quite a bit of actual naval traffic on there. There's trade as well, but there's a lot of naval ships. And so the more ships that you have from two opposing countries on these lakes, the more likely they are, honestly, to get into a fight with each other. Whether it's accidental or not, really doesn't matter. And so the first thing they did to sort of help lower the potential risk for hostilities between the countries is this agreement, which limited the naval power on the Great Lakes for U.S. and British Canada. Okay, so basically lower the temperatures, kind of a phrase we would use nowadays. Okay, the next thing that happens is the Convention of 1818. And what this is where the U.S. and the British got together and basically talked it out. It's called a negotiation, where they negotiated the border between the two countries. And the border between the U.S. and Canada, for the most part, is actually 100% set at this convention. Okay, there's a little tiny section that we'll get to later in the semester. It's way up here in the north, way up in here. It's like right there, very northwestern part of the country, current U.S. But anyways, we'll get to that later. So again, two pieces. You have the Rush-Bagot Agreement and the Convention of 1818. Okay, so that's what actually happened. Hopefully, this will be interesting to see. Hopefully you got this right as far as what you would do. If not, it's okay. Because again, what you would do is just you thinking through what would you do, right? It's an opinion. It's really not a right or wrong, but hopefully you guessed well. Okay, so if you don't have any of these notes you filled in yet, feel free to pause the video. However, we're going to move on to the next scenario or the next dilemma. Next up, this is the Seminal Indians. Now the man you see pictured here, that's none other than Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson plays a pretty pivotal role in this issue. Okay, now big problem here is that the Seminole Indians were coming out of Florida and attacking American settlers. Okay, so they'd send their warriors off, and they would attack American settlements, and then they would go back. Now remember, Florida is currently being controlled by the Spanish, so this is not U.S. territory at the time. The other thing that was going on is that many of the slaves that were escaping out of particular places like Georgia, South Carolina, more southern. The further south you were, the more likely you were to try and go to Florida, and you'd find safe haven or refuge with the Seminole Indians. So much so that actually many of the Seminoles would marry and have children with the slaves that reached them. Okay, and so this is a problem for Monroe. Okay, so what to do? All right. So my question is, what would you do? You have the Seminole Indians attacking American settlers, and you have slaves that are escaping and not being returned. Now, when you think about the second part, remember, think about in the time period, not how we look at things today, not how we view slavery today, but look at how the country would have viewed, many in the country would have viewed slavery. Keep in mind that Monroe comes from Virginia, which is a slave state. So, take a moment, pause the video, and write down in that second column what you would do if you're in Monroe's position. All right. So hopefully you did take that time to go ahead and write down what you would do. And let's take a look at what actually happened. Because to be honest, it's a bit of a hot mess. So first of all, Andrew Jackson was sent to capture the Seminole Raiders. This begins what's called the First Seminal War. Okay, so it's important to know. So again, Andrew Jackson, man, he's told to go down, take care of the Seminole Raiders, which actually makes a ton of sense. I mean, Monroe does have to defend the American citizens and the American people, and the Seminole Indians are attacking them. Now, whether we think the Seminole Indians were right to do that really doesn't matter, because again, from Monroe's position as president, he has an obligation to protect American citizens. Okay, so he sends Jackson, who you'll recall was the hero at the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. Now, problem. Jackson does more than he's supposed to. So Jackson also took over most of Spain's military posts without the president's approval. In other words, he attacks the Spanish. Well, you can imagine that when one country attacks another, this could very easily lead to a war. Now, neither Spain nor the United States really want to go to war over this. Okay? One, the Americans just got out. Remember, they're not long out of the War of 1812, and they really don't exactly have a large military. Two, Spain's got its own issues. Now, Spain, as we'll see here in a minute, has got all kinds of rebellions going on throughout South America, Latin America, so it's got its hands full with its own empire. So it really doesn't want to add something else to it. However, it can't just let another country attack it and not do anything in response. So, attention to Ohio again, of course, on this, okay? So, the resolution here is that Florida was added to the U.S. in 1819. The way this was accomplished through what's called the Adams-Onus Treaty. It's important that you know that because you are a student here in Florida and learning U.S. history. So you need to know how Florida territory becomes a part of the United States. That is the Adams-Onus Treaty. Now, this treaty did more than just add Florida. It actually settled all the border disputes between the United States and Spain. Okay? So if you take a look at the map here, what you will see is this area right, see this border goes from here, all of this right here-ish, all of that. That is on the border between what was the Louisiana Purchase, and this is all Spanish territory. It eventually becomes Texas and a whole bunch of other states, but there was some dispute of exactly where the border was. Okay, so this treaty settled that once and for all. Okay, U.S. quit trying to claim parts of Texas that it didn't have. Okay, and also paid Spain $5 million. Now you may be wondering, why? Why would the U.S. pay Spain $5 million? Well, remember who started this little war? Yeah, that'd be Jackson. Or, unfortunately, the United States because of Jackson's actions. So, this was kind of like the U.S. saying, well, look, why don't we'll give you some money, you give us the land, and we settle the rest of our disputes, and we're all good. And that's what happened, okay? So again, this is how this is resolved. So now the United States now controls this huge section, right? This whole thing. All of this, my drawing's a little off here, but you get the idea, right? This is all U.S. territory now. So now, actually, this is going to make, in some ways, it easier for the Americans to deal with the Seminole Indians, because again, now it's U.S. territory. So if they want to go and put forts there and things like that, they certainly can. Okay? So, there you go. Now, if you missed any of these notes, go ahead and make sure to put a pause and get them now. But here we go. We're going to move on to the next dilemma. Dilemma number 3, or scenario number 3. This deals with foreign policy. Okay? And this one is a big one as far as what's called the longevity of what Monroe does. In fact, it is something that we still are, from what's called foreign policy, still reference and use to this day. So, what's the background on this? Well, as I mentioned to you earlier, many South American countries were rebelling against Spanish rule and trying to win their independence. Okay? And really what's going on is they're basically asking for our help. They're like, basically, hey, you gained your independence from France, oh my gosh, from the British, and you had help from the French. So we're trying to get our freedom just like you did. Why don't you help us? But remember, the U.S. has a policy of neutrality. Washington started this in the very first presidency. Okay, so what would you do? This is the rock and the hard place that Monroe finds himself in. Okay, also keep in mind, U.S. isn't exactly in a position to be helping people, but there is something to be said for helping others to change the kind of freedom that the U.S. had obtained. So lots of tension in this. So what would you do? So go ahead and pause the video and write down in that column, what would you do in this situation? Alrighty. So now that you got your thoughts written down, you got the basic background information done, let's take a look at what actually happened, because it is a monumentally huge result. The United States issues a foreign policy statement known today as the Monroe Doctrine, and it is major. Like hundreds of years later, we are still referencing it, and there are huge parts of our foreign policy that are at the very least influenced by this Monroe Doctrine. So what does it say? Two key components. First, the U.S. would not interfere with existing European colonies in America. In other words, those countries that are wanting their independence in South America and are asking for our help, we're not going to help them because those are established European colonies. Not going to interfere with that. On the other side of that, the U.S. would oppose any new colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Another way to put this is that, or another way to think about this maybe, is if one of those countries were to gain independence, we'll help them maintain it. So the Spanish can't try to come back and like, well, we're going to retake that now, or try to establish something new. Okay? So it was a very creative way of sort of splitting the difference here, and Monroe had nothing to do with it. Well, I mean, he did. He had something to do with it. It gets his name because he's president. However, it was John Quincy Adams who actually developed the idea. Now, truth be told, Quincy Adams didn't do it on his own either. This was actually something that the British were going to be the ones to announce. However, Monroe did it first. Now, it's important that we know about the British because the British are actually the muscle behind this. Because again, U.S. is not strong like it is today. Okay? And so while this is the policy the United States takes, it is the British who provide the muscle behind the policy. Okay? All right, so let's move on to the last, but certainly not least, of the four scenarios. And this one deals with slave states. Okay? So, here's the issue at hand. Missouri wants to enter the Union as a slave state. Okay? At first glance, you may think, well, it's not good that they want to be a slave state, but there's lots of other slave states at this point. You're right. So much so that everything's in balance. The Senate is perfectly balanced, equal number of free and slave states. So if Missouri comes in as a slave state, that will make things disproportionate and interrupt that balance of power. Okay? Now, but Missouri has every right, if you will, if it wants to be a slave state, it can certainly do that. And at some level, the United States, I mean, they've met all the requirements, done all the things that the federal government has said they needed to do to go from a territory to a state. So there is some pressure and some precedent. They do need to be admitted. So the question then becomes, what's Monroe going to do? Okay? So while you think about that, make sure you are writing it down. You pause the video and go and write down what would you do? How would you try and resolve this very sticky situation for Monroe? All right. So the way this is resolved is it's not 100% on Monroe, but it certainly happens under his watch and in many ways with his blessing. So he gets some credit for it, if you will. All right. So what comes out of this is called the Missouri Compromise. And what the Missouri Compromise does is, one, first off, you'll see here it says to keep the balance of power. And it's called a two-state solution. Okay? And that two-state solution, this part right here, is important. because it's this two-state solution that's going to be used for about the next 30 years when dealing with admitting new states. Okay, so the pattern established, or basically the pattern established by the Missouri Compromise is what the U.S. will use for the next 3 decades. Okay, now there's good and bad to that. The good thing is that everyone knew, all right, so there wasn't this big like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do every time a state wanted to join the Union. The downside of that, though, is that it meant that the country is going to be divided. You'd have an equal number of free and an equal number of slave states. That's not good, okay? Again, this means your country is going to be divided, particularly on this issue. Now, how did they come up with a two-state solution when only Missouri is asking to come be a part of the United States? In comes Maine. Yay, Maine. So, Maine was originally a part of Massachusetts. Kind of weird to think about now. So, this new state is created, and Maine comes in as a free state. So, Missouri is slave, Maine is free, and the balance of power is maintained. The other part of this compromise is to also give guidance for future states out of this territory. Now, I've always thought this line was kind of strange because it seems really disproportionate in favor of of free states, but, you know, okay, sure. It's called the 3630 line. If you look on the map here, it shows that red line, which is actually in the southern border of Missouri, into, it's into what will become like, Oklahoma. And anyhow, if it's north of that line, slavery is not to be allowed. North of what's called the 3630 line, with the exception in this territory, which we would call the Louisiana Purchase, with the exception of Missouri, because again, Missouri's already done its thing. Okay? And so it just establishes a precedent and a way to handle it. Okay? But again, it's a two-state solution. Okay?